Right. Okay. Thank you. Well, firstly, thanks to Emma for organising this, and I'm sure I'll get to chat to you all after I've gone through these slides. This is a presentation that I put together it was actually for a business school module, which used to be called the Business of Climate Change, but I think it's gone through various iterations. And I've amended it a little bit for today. But essentially, what I want to talk about is different ideas about how we can support people to change behaviours in connection to a changing climate. I'm always conscious, really, that we talk a lot about climate change, but this isn't only about carbon emissions. I'm sure you all recognise that. So, for example, in the field I work in, which is transport and mobility, actually enabling behaviour change to promote active travel like walking and cycling is as important for things like noise reduction and local air pollution and the reduction of local ozone, as well as it is for carbon emissions. So I've put climate in the title, but it's not just climate. The image you see on the first slide here is a very bizarre image, which I'll come back to a bit later on, but it was a behaviour change campaign that was launched by the UK government in the year 2000. It actually looks a lot older than the year 2000. And I'm going to talk through some of the problems that are associated with the messaging that is in both the wording and the imagery of that picture a bit later on. So what I want to try and do today is to give you a bit of context about why behaviour change is seen as such an important part of dealing with the environment and climate emergency, but also what some of the problems of doing that are if we only think about behaviour change in a very narrow way. So that will become more transparent as we go through. This is one of those video clips later on, if you want to click on the text on the right-hand side. But the kind of starting place for this is really that I think our problem at the moment, although I think it's been worse in the past, is that trying to be environmentally conscious is still a little bit of an uphill struggle. This was on the land side, the magazine front page from the Environment Agency some years ago now, and an article by somebody who was attempting to spend a week doing environmentally conscious behaviours. But I think that the wording in the imagery here is very problematic because it suggests to us that by definition, behaviour change is something that is temporary when it comes to the environment, and also it's something that requires you to be saintly, which by definition, again, is not something that most of us will achieve. That, I think, is one of the challenges we face when talking about behaviour change, is making it relevant to everybody and enabling people to participate, and therefore making it accessible, which I think in the past it probably hasn't been. So what I'm going to go through, I'll try and be as brief as possible so we've got time for a chat afterwards, simply to make the point which nobody on this call probably needs to be reinforced with, which is that what we're going to talk about is quite a contested issue. I do then want to spend a bit of time giving context for behaviour change approaches which have been adopted by governments, and why I think that the ones we have at the minute are quite inadequate and quite narrow. And that's because they tend to adopt one behavioural theory framework, but there are others available, and I want to explore the benefits of some of the others. So we'll talk about behavioural theories and frameworks for studying behaviour change. Then we'll think about how that's been implemented in policy, and then I'm going to finish off by giving us 4 challenges to think about, and a little bit related to my own research that I'm doing at the moment, which is about trying to get people to move away from air travel to rail travel for continental holidays. Okay, so these slides, 2 pictures are taken from a campaign that was launched about 13 years ago, at the very end of the last Labour government. And this, I think, is one of the problems that we face when trying to communicate the science and severity of climate change, which is that the messages appear to be contradictory. Now, in fact, these two images, one of which is talking about exacerbated flooding due to extreme rainfall events due to climate change. The other one, which is talking about drought, again, an extreme event related to climate change. Both of them, of course, are scientifically verified by the evidence we have, and yet they appear to be contradictory. And they represent ways in which certain media outlets are able to twist climate change science and the climate change narrative, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So whilst generally we can agree that there's a consensus amongst most natural scientists about the human impact on the climate, in the popular media, this is still a very contested issue. And it's interesting, isn't it, that I have yet to hear a single Conservative Party leadership candidate talk about the environment and climate change. It's all about tax, which I think is telling. Now, if we think about behaviour change, which is what I'm here to talk about today, I think it's worth bearing in mind that if we were all sitting here, and clearly we wouldn't be online, but if we were sitting in a meeting back in the 1970s, when people's interest in the environment really began to get going, we wouldn't be talking about behaviour change. We would probably be talking about the state acting through regulations, through taxation, through passing new laws, through owning particular industries, but we wouldn't be talking about individual people taking action. We might be talking about collective action. We might be talking about unionization. We might be talking about Greenpeace and the Green Party and the campaign for nuclear disarmament. But we would rarely talk about individual behaviour change. And that's because we've been through this fundamental political shift over the last 40 years, away from the idea that groups of collectives can do good and that the state, as the democratic kind of representative of the people, can own things or regulate things. We've gone from that model to a model where, in fact, it's much more politically popular to believe in a small state and to believe in individual actions which are exercised through consumption decisions. And that is why we have such a focus on this last sub-bullet point on the screen, which is the idea of exhortation. In other words, it's no longer acceptable politically for the state to own things or to pass a lot of laws or to raise taxes, as we are seeing with the leadership contest in the Conservative Party. So what we're really left with is something I think is very glib, which is asking people to do the right thing and hoping that they will. And this is what is referred to by quite a few authors and has been for the last 20 years or so, is this idea of citizen consumers. It's a very tenuous concept that was developed by politicians in the 1990s in the UK and the United States that treads a tightrope. On the one hand, between saying, well, we have some kind of idea about what being a good citizen is like. So we think that good citizens will be environmentally responsible. But we don't, on the other hand, want to disrupt the market mechanisms that make the free market economy what it is. So the only way that we can really manage the environment is trying to get individuals to make consumption decisions that are responsible in some way. So the key aspect for the last 30 years or so of government policy making in North America and the UK has been about choice. It's about saying we're not going to regulate things or tax things really, but we're going to do the choice. Now that raises for me as an academic very interesting questions, which I won't go into today, about who decides what environmental responsibility is. And certainly I think probably the UK government of all political colours has always taken a very weak approach to deciding what an environmentally responsible citizen is. But the key point is we tend to focus very much on choice through the market. And that's where we get to something you've probably all heard of, which is this idea of nudging, which was a conceptual idea developed by two psychologists from the United States, published in this book that you see on the left-hand side in 2008. And the idea of nudge is essentially that what we try and do is to use the free market to manipulate people's decision-making. Now, it developed out of health psychology. So the idea was, how do we get people, when they go supermarket shopping, to make better decisions about the food that they purchase? How do we get people to purchase healthier food rather than salty, sugary, fatty, ready meals? The crucial principle, as you can see from that first quotation on the screen, is that nudge doesn't allow you to remove choices. Choice is key. You must always have a choice, but rather you're trying to make the choice that you want to manipulate people to take the most favorable one. And that's a fundamental shift from the idea that the state or a group of collectives has an idea about what a good thing to do is. It's about saying that a small group in the state decides that this is the way people should live their lives. And through the market, they're going to manipulate choices. And there's lots of discussion in the academic literature about whether that's an ethical thing to do without being transparent about it. Now, that has led, really since the 2000s, since kind of the year 2000 onwards, with the Labour government and the coalition and now the Conservative government, to a whole raft of policies and initiatives and investments in promoting sustainable lifestyles. There's a quotation here actually from our last UK Sustainable Development Strategy. It was published way back in 2005. And the crucial thing in this quotation is this idea that you and I have to make better choices. So the government doesn't have the confidence to compel us to make those choices. Rather, it says, we want to nudge you in the right direction. And that led to a whole raft of behaviour change campaigns, Act on CO2 from about 13, 14 years ago. And if I bring in a couple of other things, here's on the top here, a couple of examples from the local area. So it might be about car sharing, it might be trying to use more public transport, engaging active travel like cycling. It might be trying to reduce the amount that you fly, although whenever that has been raised, it's very interesting that the government has always really stamped on that and said, well, no, we're going to have great technology to mean that people will be able to fly all over the world. We don't want to stop you flying because it's so important to the economy. But what we have largely seen, as you'll all be very aware of, is a whole series of behaviour change initiatives that are trying to nudge people into particular directions. And it's very much focused at the individual scale. It's not about people working collectively for change. It's not about changing the system or the infrastructure. It's rather about persuading people that they should do what the state believes is the right thing. And that's when we return to this image that I started off at the beginning of the talk, this "I'm doing your bit" poster from the year 2000. And you can see that the tagline at the bottom says, when you can, leave your car at home and walk. Now, I don't know about you, but I mean, I think there's an interesting critique we could make of this poster, apart from the fact that it's rather curious that if you want people to walk, you'd expect them to dress up in motocross outfits and bike helmets. It's just very odd. But it's interesting that the advert is very much focused on you as the individual, and also when you can. So all of these things begin to weaken the message. It's a poor image. It's a poor suggestion in terms of your ability to identify with the individuals in the advert. It's a fairly weakly framed request. And if we think about what the assumptions are behind the people who developed this advertisement, the basic one is essentially a very simple idea that if we can give people information about what they should do, they will logically, as rational actors, take on that information and then they will go and act. But as we all know, actually behaviours are very complex. And back in the year 2000, this was a really important academic article that came out in a psychology journal, the Journal of Social Issues, by Doug Mackenzie Moore. And actually, as you can see, as he says in this quotation here, really changing behaviors is far more than just about giving people information. There are so many factors that will underpin why people make decisions that they do, that simply trying to fill what's referred to as an information deficit by persuading people that they should do the right thing by giving them rational information is really problematic. This slide was given to me by Professor Jeff French, who works in the field of social marketing and health change behaviours. And he used this slide, as I'm going to, simply to make the point that if I asked the audience here today, well, what kinds of things affect the way that you behave, the kinds of foods that you buy, or how you use energy, or whether you choose to walk or cycle, or whether you choose to throw your waste in a recycling container or not, they're going to be influenced by all these kinds of factors that you see on the screen here. So it might be your social norms or the ease of undertaking the behavior, your underpinning values and beliefs, the system that you live in and the pressures that you're under, and so on. So understanding behavior is really complex. And one of the challenges that we've faced is that policymakers have tried to oversimplify it by simply filling an information deficit. So how can we begin to unpack what we mean by behavior change and some of the challenges that we face and some of the opportunities that I think we have by adopting perhaps different theoretical perspectives? And I'm going to take you very quickly through three key ideas that tend to underpin any behavioral strategy that you're likely to come across. And the first one is the most popular. This is the one that if you stacked up, all of the hard copies of the papers published on behavior change, this by far and away would be the biggest pile. And this one is what dominates a lot of government thinking on behavioral change. Now, it's what I've probably rather unfairly framed as a psychological approach. And I think there's a huge value, I should say now, in what a lot of psychologists do on behavior change. But a particular strand of psychology, particularly behavioral economics, has been adopted by policymakers, which has been used, I think, in quite a narrow way. And psychological approaches are really driven by existing psychological theories, of which I'll show you one in a minute. They're very focused on the ways that individuals make decisions through their cognitions, through the ways that they think about issues. Very often they're experimental approaches in design. So you might have two groups of people and one group has a behavioral intervention and another group doesn't, and you test the validity of the intervention. It tends to be focused on very large scale quantitative studies of people's attitudes and values and so on. And it makes what I call here epistemological assumptions. And epistemology, as you probably know, is the foundation of what we understand to be reality, to be knowledge. And this makes the assumption, this approach, that we can make the assumption that we can measure people's attitudes, we can measure their values, we can measure their reported behavior, and we can come up with models, statistical models of the way that people think about behavior change, hopefully to be able to predict what they will do. I knew I'd do something silly. There we are. Right, there we are. So this is a typical example of that kind of psychological approach, which is called the theory of planned behavior. And it's a linear model. So we move from left to right and we say, if we want to predict someone's behavior, the theory suggests that that is going to be determined by someone's intention to behave. And that will in turn be influenced by their attitudes towards the behavior, their subjective norms, what they think other people expect them to do, and their perceived behavioral control, the extent to which they think they have the ability to undertake the behavior. And a lot of studies are really about collecting large amounts of data from individuals and putting it into statistical packages and trying to understand for different kinds of behaviors the influence of these different factors. So it's a very quantitative, individually focused approach. An alternative, and it is radically different, and it's something that I'm using at the moment in the research that I'm doing, comes from sociology rather than psychology. And this, as much sociological research is driven by the idea of a grounded approach, an approach that says, rather than starting with a theory that we already have, we go out and observe, we find out what's happening, we watch the way that people behave, and we begin to build our theories from the ground up, hence grounded theory. Sociologists tend to focus not on the individual, but on societal processes and societal units, so families, households, groups, communities. And as such, their studies tend to be more observational and ethnographic in nature. In other words, they use more qualitative methods. So they might use interviews or participant observation. They might go and observe, perhaps if they take an anthropological perspective, what's going on over long periods of time. And they draw their conclusions from those observations. So as an example of a social practice sociological approach, if we look at this picture, we might say, well, what does this picture show us? From a psychology point of view, which was the first theoretical perspective I talked about, this picture would represent several hundred individual car drivers on a given day making a decision that they are going to drive to work. And that decision will have been influenced by a whole series of factors, such as their attitudes and so on. What a sociologist sees instead is actually something that they would call a social practice. The social practice that we see in the picture is commuting. That's what's of interest. The unit of analysis is commuting. So it's not about individual decision-making by each person driving a car. It's about the culture of commuting, which is underpinned by a century or more of the development of road infrastructures, of suburban settlements, of the favouring of motor vehicles over other forms of transport technology, over the cheap exploitation of oil from overseas oil fields. All of those things support the practice of commuting. So it's not about the individual decision to drive, it's about the fact that our culture promotes commuting through the way that we structure our working days and our working lives. So if we think then about what the sociological underlying social and economic trends are that might drive the social practice of driving, we might identify these three things, for example. So on the bottom right, we might say that driving is associated with particular masculinities. We know that car companies tend to target particular models of particular groups, and those may be gendered in nature. So there's something there about connecting with people's identity, which has been very carefully and cleverly honed by car manufacturers. Secondly, on the top right, a big economic trend that has driven the social practice of driving is the construction of housing estates, which are nowhere near transport links, such as buses and trains. They're difficult to walk around, they're difficult to cycle to, they have no community services, no shops, and very few workplaces. So that promotes individual car-based commuting. And then on the left-hand side, on the negative side, something that drives people literally away from public transport is the fact that there's been huge disinvestment in bus services, as we know very well, which means that travelling by public transport, in particular bus, outside of the London metropolitan area is seen as very expensive, very slow, very unattractive, and not in accordance with the kinds of identity that people might want to build. So from a sociological perspective, the social practice of driving, just as an example, is promoted by these big social and economic trends. And then the final one I want to focus on before I begin to round up this afternoon is, intriguingly, between the two of these, although it tends to be the more of the first, which is a set of literature that expanded in about 15 to 20 years ago under the New Labour government, which is what we would call as academics grey literature. This is research that's been commissioned by government departments. It's not really academic in nature, in that it's not about asking intellectual questions. It's much more about asking, how can we change something practically on the ground? Although it often draws on key academic ideas, very often from psychology. So here's a typical example that was highly influential, really from about 2005 onwards. It is what formed the basis of the, at one time, the number 10 nudge unit, the behavioural insights team, which is now a semi-independent organisation linked to government. And they promoted the idea of social marketing. And this was the idea that we could use conventional marketing techniques to help us promote social and environmental goods. So we would use the kind of tripartite elements of marketing, which is about understanding audience segmentation. So understanding your audience, just as a supermarket does, it collects data on people, puts them into different clusters, and then targets particular messages at them. Will also be about developing a good marketing mix for each of those segments. And it'll also be about collecting insights, getting lots and lots of data and information about people. So social marketing has often been a way of really, I suppose, implementing ideas about nudge in a very practical way. And this formed back in 2008, the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs framework for pro-environmental behaviours, where they set a series of behavioural goals, and then they defined 7 segments of the UK population, which would have different kinds of policies targeted upon them. So here's an example. So if we have a look at the matrix that we've got on the screen here, you can see that these 7 segments are positioned according to someone's willingness and their ability to act on a series of pro-environmental behaviours, such as reducing car use, recycling waste, using less energy, saving water, and so on. So you can see on the top right, you've got people who are very willing and able to act. They're what they called positive greens. These are people who we just don't need to worry about because they're already doing all this stuff. All the way through to my favorite category in terms of the name on the left-hand side, number 7, which is the honestly engaged. People who are just not interested. They might have the ability to act to some extent. They might have a certain level of willingness, but actually they just don't really care. And the argument being made in DEFRA's strategy from 2008 was probably, well, we need to probably focus on people in the middle segments who have got part of the way, but we could take them on a longer journey. So that was social marketing. That is something that has actually happened. That has underpinned a lot of the behavior change policies that you will have seen around the place. I've got a set of questions I'm now going to ask at the end that might form the basis of our discussion in just a minute. The first one is something that was raised in an amazing report by Tom Crompton and John Ferguson. Tom Crompton is an activist. He works for the World Wild Fund for Nature. John Ferguson is a psychologist from Aarhus University in Denmark. And they wrote a really interesting WWF pamphlet in 2009, which was a question they framed, which was simple and painless. And they were referring to this idea that actually being environmentally conscious is really simple and it doesn't require much effort at all. And the quotation here, I think, is very telling, which is that they kind of basically say the cumulative impact of large numbers of individuals making marginal improvements in their environmental decision-making is a marginal collective improvement in environmental impact. In other words, we need much more systemic, large-scale, fundamental changes, which we're probably not going to achieve if we continue down this rather narrow path of encouraging and nudging people to occasionally do the right thing when it's okay with them. Again, I'm paraphrasing there, of course. So much is enough. Secondly, therefore, that leads us to this question about whether the citizen consumer framework that I've articulated is going to be sufficient. And back in 2011, the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee issued quite a scathing report about the idea of the way that nudge had been and social marketing had been used by central government, by suggesting that actually, if for example, you really wanted to reduce car use, you'd have to do a lot more than simply trying to persuade people to do the right thing. You would need changes in regulations. You would need changes in fiscal disincentives, as they said. So what we call the neoliberal way of trying to change people's behavior, which is the idea that we ask them to be nice, that we don't really make any changes in the system to support and enable their behavior change, but we simply try to nudge them in the right direction. That is something that has been challenged. Third, I think we can learn a lot from that second perspective from theory that I talked to you about, which was the sociological perspective, by thinking about this idea of social practices, which are, as Vivek and Momas said in 2008, conceived as being routine driven every day and situated in time and space. In other words, these are things that are underpinned by the very way that our society is structured. So when I talk to my students in my final year, and I run it on transport and mobility, and I ask the question, why do you travel in the way that you do? We shouldn't be thinking about this as an individual. We should think about the social practices of commuting, of visiting friends and relatives, of flying away on overseas holidays, and what are the systems that enable that to happen? And they have been developed over decades. They've been the result of particular kinds of political decisions, and there are particular infrastructures and technologies that support very carbon intensive behaviors and suppress the change to other kinds of behaviors. And this is something that I think is interesting as an alternative approach, this idea of social practices. This is a very simple articulation of how we can think about social practices and begin to identify them in our own lives, that was developed by Elizabeth Shove and her colleagues. Elizabeth Shove, a sociologist, an environmental sociologist from Lancaster University. And she talks about the way that social practices emerge through the combination of three things. Firstly, the way that meaning is given to a practice, the fact that it becomes socially desirable, for example, to fly away on long-haul holidays. That's something that is deemed by many people to be a symbol of status. It's highly desirable, it makes a good use of time, and so on. Secondly, it's about the competencies that people require to be able to engage in a practice. So if I use the example of air travel again, the competencies that have been developed over many years are associated with things like online booking, being able to navigate airline websites, being able to navigate airports, and so on. And then finally, of course, we need the materials, we need the infrastructures that enable a practice to develop. So if I think back to the pre-war era in the United States, a very fundamental set of decisions were made about not to invest in railroads and intercity train travel and in streetcars, but rather to invest in roads and the construction of private cars. So the materiality of mobility moved sharply towards favouring the individual rather than the collective. So as my final slide, before I finish now, I thought you might like an insight into a project that I'm developing at the minute with Gareth Shaw, who's a professor in the business school. And in this project, what we're trying to do is we're working with 10 tour companies, including Eurostar, to try and think about how we could shift people away from cheap short-haul air travel to continental Europe to rail travel for holidays, and we are looking at all different kinds of holidays. So there might be ski holidays, there might be family package holidays, they might be independent booking holidays. And if you think about what I started talking about in terms of why the practice of air travel has become so prominent, this is a table that's taken from a book chapter that we've just had published. And you can see in relation to that social practices framework that it's not really about individual decision making. It's about the meanings, competencies, and materials that have evolved over decades in the airline industry and the tourism industry that have made traveling by air just a natural decision. So actually, to try and work against that and change your behavior is really difficult because you are working against the system. So the project we're trying to develop is to say, how can we understand the meanings, the competencies, and the materialities that we would need to make rail travel for holidays within Europe the thing that becomes the dominant social practice? And I think that's really quite exciting because it's getting us away from just saying, how can we persuade this individual to change their behavior, which probably won't last anyway, to saying, how could we change the system, which I think is a more interesting question. Okay, Emma, I'm going to finish there, so I'll stop sharing my slides and say thank you and over to the audience.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Sorry, I cut out like halfway because my Zoom university Wi-Fi. Have I come back? Yeah. Have I
Yes.
come back?
Well, we can hear you. We can't see you.
I know, it's saying that my video is working. What is happening?
It's very odd. It happens a lot to me with students on Teams for some reason, but yeah.
You know, I might put it on my phone.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, this is really odd. Surface camera. What I'm going to do is I'm going to join it on my phone. But no, thank you so much. Does anyone have any like initial thoughts they just want to like get out while I'm sorting out my camera?
Hi. So since I have joined with the wrong ID here of my partner, so my name is Pooja. I'm a master's student here in international business. I simply love the slides and your presentation, to be very honest, because I have a keen interest in sustainable mobility. I have been doing the same from last 5 years in my country, in my city. I'm also the bicycle mayor of the city over there.
Ah.
So yeah, so we are actually working on a mission of 50 by 30, that is by 2030. 50% of city trips should be on bicycles, and that actually requires a lots of the change in the behavior of the people. And I actually agree whatever you said over here, that it is up. The things start from us. We need to start initially. We need to take a step ahead, and then only people follow us. So I agree. I mean, I was actually fascinated. It's actually the reality which you showed us over the slides. Apart from that, when you were talking about this the working thing, the cycle to work thing, why are the organizations, I mean, I have raised this point so many times whenever I attend any sustainable meeting here in UK, why the incentivizing of the employees is not done here? I mean, I don't know if it's actually happening, but normally what we do is, so I started this cycle to work in my city. We started incentivizing the best employee with the bicycles, a free bicycle for the entire month. They were the appraisals which used to happen in every 6 months time. It used to even take care of how many, what's their contribution towards the environment. Are they walking? Are they actually cycling? How are they doing it? So even those points were calculated. And it was not just the way they are working or their performance within the company, but how are they as an individual to their teammates, to the environment? Why all these factors still not being considered? I mean, here in the country. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thank you. And I'm glad the talk resonated with you. So the cycling one, I think, is really interesting. For quite a few years now, there's been a cycle to work scheme, which a lot of employers in Britain have used. I don't think it's terribly well promoted, but I would say at the university, obviously, which is my employer, that the number of cycling trips has radically increased over the last 10 years or so. Not particularly because of cycle to work, I think partly because of restrictions on car parking on the campus, but also because there has been some investment in infrastructure like bike parks and showers and so on. The challenge I think we've got now in a city like Exeter is that we've perhaps reached what is often referred to as the low-hanging fruit, so the easy people to get to. But the challenge I think we've got now is more systematic, which is what I was getting at the end of the talk, which is, for example, the road network is still very poor if you're a cyclist. Many people in research we did about 6 years ago in Exeter were very frightened of cycling in the city. They think it's quite dangerous. So that's fine if you're a confident cyclist, but if you're not, that's going to be an issue. Yeah. I think another thing is that our other transport modes are not integrated with cycling, so they don't support cycling. When I was fortunate enough to be in Vancouver for 3 months, 13 years ago, every single bus in the whole city had 2 bike racks. Wow. Now that meant that somebody who'd cycle to work and they weren't very confident and they didn't like cycling in the rain, it meant that if it was raining when they wanted to go home, they just popped their bike on the bus. Oh, and the employer gave them a free bus pass. That was another thing. So there's a lack of I mean, and the other thing, I mean, this is, most of you know this, if you've ever tried to take a bicycle on a train in this country, it is a total nightmare. And it's also the same on much of the continent, actually, which again, it is completely crazy. So I think we've reached the point with cycling where we can persuade people to change, but the next group are not going to change unless there are these systemic changes. And a big problem is that in decision making in cities in Britain, it is still dominated by traffic engineers who were trained to build roads for cars. And that's actually a really systemic knowledge problem, because we're not employing engineers who were trained to build roads for cyclists or pedestrians. Anyway, I'll stop ranting at that point, but I agree with you.
Actually, you know, when you talk about UK in this perspective, I feel like, I mean, I come from India, so we do not have any kind of infrastructure. So when you say that we do not have infrastructure for cycling, you know, I feel bad. I mean, we do not even stand anywhere. The point is, I mean, what I did over there was, so I come from Jaipur. It's a UNESCO certified city. So we have the forts and palaces over there. So we started, I know it's always like, let's go to the policymakers, let's talk with them. We should have policies, we should have all this thing. The point was, let's start doing from ourselves. The question you raised, we made a bicycle circuit in the city. And then we distributed, you know, and we're even trying to put it over the GPS. So now a cyclist and you know, a pedestrian, they are not supposed to be on the main roads. They can easily ride and walk within the, you know, the nook and corner of the city. I mean, the tourist basically over here, and that can be done. Talking about Exeter over here, it's a beautiful historical city, and if a kind of a bicycle circuit, if it can be developed as well over here, it will be, I mean, it will be amazing. Yeah. Even I'm afraid riding here, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because yeah, they drive so fast here in the city.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, no, it's so true. Thank you so much. Sorry, this is really weird because I'm using my phone on one and I'm using my audio for here. A question that I wanted to ask was, have you seen, like, in terms of, like, obviously DEFRA, I was shocked by the fact that that quote was from 2009, and like the progress that seems to come from, like, obviously authority just seems to be so slow. Have you seen any examples, like thinking about like transport, especially because obviously that's your area, of like where people power has changed policy in like the transport sector maybe?
Well, I suppose the best example is probably what happened during COVID, where, as you know, in Britain, there was the creation of what initially were temporary cycle lanes, road closures, that kind of thing. And I think it is interesting that in a lot of cases, those have become permanent due to community pressure. So what appears to have happened is that people have suddenly begun to realize how nice their road is when there are not cars going at 40 miles an hour down it, and they can cycle on the road and they can walk down the road. And so I think those kinds of examples are where actually people have used the democratic process through their local authority to lobby for a permanent change. And I think that, and that's been quite successful, because there's been quite vociferous opposition by car drivers, but actually the local community in many cases has won out, as they said, actually our quality of life is better, we have less noise pollution, we have less local air pollution, it's a more pleasant place to be. So I think the examples tends to be very localized, I think, in nature, rather than at a bigger scale, I think. And that's partly because we've kind of lost in Britain the kind of the art of the big protest in general. We, you know, and which is a shame, I think. But but I think that those local examples are good, and you tend to find other examples in. Again, it might be that the communities are really good actually at acting on things like waste. That tends to be a very a signature issue for communities, and they're able to kind of promote more environmentally sustainable waste practices. So I think it does happen. But my experience of working with communities on climate change in general is that very often there is a lack of local capacity, because people tend to find they come up against a lot of bureaucracy in local authorities, and people just get tired because it's really difficult to make change happen. So I think it's rather sporadic, Emma, but it does happen, I think.
Yeah, no, it's so true. Thank you. Because I run a repair cafe in my hometown, which has probably been like the best thing for our community.
Yeah.
But even that, yeah, it's like the way bureaucracy just stops any action, or be it bureaucracy or just plain right laws against protest. So yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? Just cautious of time. We've got like, I guess, 5 or so minutes before we check out. That was such a good presentation, and I think.
Can I ask you one question, Emma? You may not know about this, and I need to check it out. But I read in the local paper that the bus company is withdrawing the uni bus service for the summer vacation from the 31st of July. And I don't know if you've heard anything about that.
Yeah, so because I'm taking up post of liberation and equality at the Guild, and something that that I worked for as a student was the night bus.
Yes.
And I've literally, like last week, I've emailed like all the councillors and stuff, and I've got meetings with like uni leadership to see if we can bring it back. But yeah, no, it seems to be that they've cut like a lot of services, including the night bus, which obviously not only was a environmentally friendly initiative, that was mainly about safety, like student safety.
Yeah, of course.
And I think obviously public transport in general is a safer mode of transport. But no, that's something that I'm literally going to be working on to hopefully get the night bus back for freshers. Did you see that on Devon Live? Because I saw it on Devon Live.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I'm very old school. I get the Express and Echo delivered,
nice.
but it will have been on Devon Live because it's the same thing. But I was really shocked that they've actually withdrawing the whole bus service for the period of the vacation, because of course I know many students aren't here, but of course some students are here. But what happens to staff who want to get to the campus by bus during the summer vacation? I just couldn't believe it.
Oh, is that the uni minibus?
You know, this is the Stagecoach uni bus that comes from the city centre.
Oh wow. Okay, I'll add that to my list.
Could you? Yeah, and I'm very happy to liaise with you if you want to start a campaign, because I just feel, for me, when I read this, I just couldn't believe that we, you know, we know that the bus service in Exeter is not very good. And now they're cutting more services, and I think that's just a really negative thing to do, because if you were traveling by bus every day as an employee, and then you found out that for 2 months over the summer you couldn't do that, well, what would you do? You'd start using your car again, possibly. Anyway, so yeah, if you get anywhere, let me know. But I was a bit shocked by that.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. We need that German €9 train ticket. That would be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, did anyone else have anything they wanted to chip in, or any like projects you might be working on? I know that we're doing like that. Me and Meg are working on like the plant-based unis campaign. That's kind of like our focus for the next year.
I was going to say, Emma, just before anybody else got a question as well. So in geography, I'm sorry, I don't know if anybody here is a geographer, but yes, excellent. Yeah. So we run field courses internationally in the final year. But first thing we've done is we've removed all of them from elsewhere apart from Europe. But we're going to be running our first one in March next year to the Bay of Naples by train. So everybody will go by train. And we obviously, I don't know what will happen in future years, but the aspiration I think we have is to move all of our trips as far as we can to train only, because that just makes sense. And it would be a significant carbon saving for us. Partly, it's a bit of a demonstrator to the university that actually this can be done, and actually we will build in part of the module learning and assessment into the train trip. So it's not going to be dead time, it's going to be productive time. And you kind of think, what an amazing thing to do. You go from Exeter to Italy and you go through the Alps. And anyway, so I just wanted to let people know that there's something practical happening there.
That's really good. That's something I remember talking to you about when we did those vlogs about that, because I got the train. I got invited to speak at this like the Global Progress Summit in Rome, and they were like, "Oh, we'll book your flights." And I was like, "I'm sorry, but if I'm coming to your climate change conference, I'm going by train." So I cost them about. So I got the train from well, my hometown in Blandford in Dorset to Rome. So if you need, you know, anyone to speak on their experience of getting the train to Italy, I mean, it was about 3 times the cost, but you know, you got to have the demand there. And it was not gonna lie, it was horrendous. I shouldn't say that, but it wasn't like the best train journey I've ever had, but it was fun. It was part of the journey. It was fun. I saw my friend in Paris.
And there's a really good, if anybody's interested, because I met a couple of students at Grand Challenges who have gone interrailing this summer. There is a website, it's just, I think it's seat61.com, or it's seat61 anyway. And this guy who's a partner on our project basically this website tells you how to do almost every rail journey from the UK to any part of Europe and beyond. And it is just amazing tips, and he's got lots of videos on YouTube as well. So if you're ever doing it again, he's really good at explaining the best way to get to places.
That's incredibly cool, because I use that website all the time.
Good. Yeah,
that's very cool. I'm gonna add that to my useful links. Amazing. But yeah, if you had any other students as well, because we're basically, I said at the start of this workshop, but the intention with this group is I'm setting up in November like a climate justice week, to kind of offset the like attention on COP27. It's going to be very much about like locally focused initiatives and like campaigning, and more like actual practical stuff. So that'll be like November. So yeah,
I think I had a little meeting yesterday with Ursula, who I think she
brilliant.
So I think the three of us may get together perhaps in August, September to talk about it more. But yeah, I'll be very happy to help with that.
Amazing. Awesome. Okay, at this point we just like to do a check out of how we're feeling about anything, about the climate crisis or whatever. So I'll go first. I'm feeling good. Coming to these sessions just really like gives me energy and joy and hope, because I think after spending like a long day at work with people who like don't speak your language sometimes, it's really nice just to like reconnect. So yeah, and I'm gonna go. I might go to the outdoor pool tonight. But yeah, I'll hand over to Megan.
Hello, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Stuart. It's a really great talk. I'm quite interested in your research on changing travel habits, and it's good to hear about the flying with field trips, because I was wondering about that. But yeah, very grateful to be here, and yeah, thank you everyone.
I'll do your handover because I'm so generous. Is Elise still in the building? Have we still got Elise? Yeah, we do. Of course we do.
Yeah, feeling good. Yeah, it was again nice to have a bit more of an interacting discussion and Zoom than what I've been the whole day in. And also I was really happy to hear that you're changing the way fieldwork organizing geography. That's really cool. And hopefully there's something that will change as well for conferences for academics. I'm a PhD student, and the other day we had a chat with my supervisor about organizing a conference somewhere in France, and yeah, she seemed to be really keen to get the option for everyone to go by train, and that's really like, it gives me hope when I see that it's changing, and so it's great.
Should we hand over to Kimberly?
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. That's a really, really interesting talk. I'm also that's really cool that geography can kind of lead the way with changing habits around travel and transport. Yeah, I'm feeling good, and yeah.
Awesome. Pooja?
Yes, so for me, as I said previously as well, I love the session because it was something which I can relate directly. So yeah, amazing it was. Thank you so much.
Last but not least, Bella.
Yeah, I echo everyone's thanks as well. My undergrad was psychology, but I think from the description that you just gave, maybe I'm more of a sociologist actually. Also really interesting looking at that image of the campaign with the race car drivers trying to get people to walk instead of drive. I've been doing a lot of reading into climate communications at the moment, and it just kind of reinforced to me how important the credibility of the messenger is. Like when it said, "Are you doing your bit?" at the top, I was just thinking about whether the people who designed that would have been doing their bit, and like Boris Johnson flying to COP last year and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think sometimes you can forget how significant that is, the actual qualities of the people giving the message. So yeah, that was really interesting. Is that everyone?
That is indeed. Stuart, you can check out. How are you feeling?
Yeah, well, I'm very energized, actually. Thank you. So it's a nice way to end the day because it's been a very busy day. So thank you for, it's lovely to have both the feedback, but also just the discussion. So that's really good, and positivity. And I'm feeling good because I'm later tonight, or in about half an hour, going to get on my bike and go to Exmouth to meet some friends and have a picnic. So that'll be nice on my bike. So that'll be good. Thank you.
Awesome. Amazing. We'll have to, if people in the climate justice workshops, we're going to do like a social or something in Freshers Week. Just to, yeah, chill. But yeah, thank you so much. Hope everyone has a nice evening. Enjoy the sunshine. Stay safe. And our next one is Wednesday, next Wednesday. But I'll probably send you another email. Just a reminder. Cool. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Bye.
guys. Thank you.
Thank you.